thank you. I met Jérôme a few years ago, and it was a marvelous encounter because he came to ask me to propose me some questions concerning La Facture, and I was completely useless. And I am probably the only incompetent person in this room concerning art, and he insisted that I would talk today. So, but he allowed me to talk about anything I wanted. So the only thing I can do is to share with you a few ideas which may be relevant to the question you are asking. Okay? Maybe not. You will have to judge. Okay. So, alors c'est comme ça, on appuie là-dessus. So, I'm sorry because I thought it would be in French, so my slides are in French, but I will speak English. I generally make talks in English, but it was an error. So it will be all, I will translate everything. So my hypothesis, which I would like to propose, of course, all this is trivial, is the experience of facture is at the confluence of gesture, but also of gaze. It's not only what is on the canvas, but it's a game between the brain and what is on the canvas. And I know that there are a number of analytical philosophers in this room, but I belong to the other camp, and I will quote Merleau-Ponty, La vision est palpation par le regard, which is a summary of what basically is what I would like to the challenge. I have three parts. First, I will talk about the laws of production and perception of gesture to show that they are common. Then I will say a few things about gaze that many of you know already, but just that may be relevant. And then I will finish on the problem of empathy and sympathy, because there is this problem of interaction with the painting, not directly on the problem of canvas, but more generally. And I will try to convince you that there is a fundamental difference between sympathy and empathy. So let's start. Perception of a gesture, of movement. I like to quote this two quotations from Poincaré. To localize a point in space is simply to imagine the movement necessary to reach it. It is not a question of representing the movements themselves, but simply the muscular sensation which accompany them. This is one of the greatest géomètres in the history of man, and he said that when you see a figure written on a paper, basically the foundation of geometry is in the movement, the muscles. And Einstein said Poincaré is right, the fatal error that the mental necessity preceding all experience is at the basis of Euclidean geometry is due to the fact that the empirical basis on which is based the axiomatic construction of Euclidean geometry was forgotten. Geometry must be considered as a physical science whose utility must be judged by its relation with l'expérience sensible. What a pleasure for a physiologist. All right? So basically it means that when we perceive a form or even a stroke, something written on paper, we actually, that was the intuition that immediately we have a perception of the movement with our muscles, with our body. And which of course is a fashion now, everything is being embodied, etc. But this was from these great mathematicians. And this attitude was not really, was forgotten until recently. What is interesting, which I give you a few examples, which many of you know, of course, is that there are common laws, because it's not enough to say that, of course, when we see a stroke, we perceive the movement. We are trying as physiologists to understand why. What is happening in the brain, which allows us to perceive this movement from the painted stroke. And one of the reasons is that there are common laws for production of the movement and for perception. Of course, the great discovery of this century is the mirror system by Rizzolatti, which shows that the same neurons are activated by observation and execution of action. Everybody knows that today, and actually maybe too many functions have been attributed to the system, but it is a very important discovery, which says that in this, not only in the frontal cortex, but in the network, there is this immediate perception we have of the movement done by somebody else. And it is, but that is not all. This capacity we have to understand why we have this capacity, particularly for natural movements. The stroke, the natural movement. And this capacity, I think, is what has been shown, and you probably all know the literature about so-called point movements. This capacity is valid only if the movement obeys simplifying laws, which I call simplex. And I even wrote a book, La Simplexité, because I got a bit fed up with complexity, and we discovered now that there are so many of these laws which are elegant, they are not so simple, which are being produced by evolution to allow controlling movement, perception, etc. So there are these laws, there are many, many of them. We are now discovering them. They are very general. They allow us to interact with the world, and they probably also are the laws which are implemented in our brain, which allow us to perceive from the painting stroke or canvas or forms drawn on the painting immediately what is on the intention. An example of one of these laws is called the two-third power law. It is the fact that if I draw an ellipse like this, natural movement, or if I do a stroke, there is a very tight relation between the radius of curvature and the tangential velocity, which means that I go slowly here and fast. Fast and slowly. Fast, slowly, fast. When curvature is great, la courbure est grande, I go slowly and then I go fast. Linear relation, remarkably linear, tight, during a natural movement, any kind of movement, any kind of natural movement of the arm between the tangential velocity and the radius of curvature. The reason for that we are discussing with many people. There are many hypotheses, and I have no time to go into that, but that's a very simplifying principle which is underlying probably the reason for which we perceive natural movements. And we have shown in my lab that this law also applies for locomotor movement. When I run around an ellipse with locomotion, it's also obeyed. It's also obeyed for pursuit eye movement. So it reflects a very general brain mechanism for generating movements, whatever is the effector. And some people actually paint with their tongue. Paralyzed people. I receive these paintings every Christmas of painters. And so there are some general laws underlying the production movement. And what is remarkable is that Viviani has also shown that this law of production constrains perception. So that if I do this with my finger now, you will perceive my point as of constant velocity only if it has not constant velocity. If I give it a real constant velocity, you will perceive it having not constant velocity. So laws of production of movement also constrain perception. Stéphanie est très étonnée. That's a fact. Not a speculation, it's a fact. And once more, it shows how much these two things, c'est fini. La distinction entre perception et action, c'est terminé. Voilà. So it's very interesting, and it's probably one of the foundations of our capacity to extract from what you see here the movement you would do if you would locomote along an ellipse. And you would probably perceive also, I'm going to be too long. So this is basically the picture I use for people just to show that I believe that if we have this immediate perception of the movement. I was very jealous because I wanted to do the MRI study, and as you know, Semir Zeki did it first. And he showed that when you perceive that, you activate MT, which was very beautiful, because actually this is Poincaré, this is Einstein, we do immediately activate the movement areas in our brain when we see that, as long as it has been done by a natural gesture. So the form is produced by, and we have looked into this in depth now, with Tamar Flash from Weizmann Institute in Israel, who is a mathematician and a physiologist, and Daniel Benquin here was a mathematician, a great geometre, Daniel Benquin. And we have compared the data in our two labs with exactly the same movement for drawing with the hand and for locomotion. And the mathematics, which I don't understand because they are too difficult. The mathematics has allowed us to show that actually, in order to model correctly the relation between time and form, we have to suppose that the brain uses a combination of several geometries, a few of them being non-Euclidean. We all intuitively think as if our brain was working with Euclidean geometry. It is not the case. We are basically working with affine, equiaffine geometries, non-Euclidean. And this had been already said by Jan Kundering from Holland many years ago. Most of you probably know his work. Jan Kundering, for visual perception, had already said at least 20 years ago that the brain for space and position was working with non-Euclidean, even Riemannian. He also has beautiful recent work on sculpture, perception of forms. So the brain is using these non-Euclidean geometry, and for me it's probably normal because I'm not a dualist and I think that the mathematical concepts come from the brain and they are not somewhere in a strange space. They are reflecting brain projects. So there are deep reasons for our capacity, when we look at such things on the screen, to immediately infer the movement which was at the origin. And these capacities have to be looked at with models which are not trivial models in terms of mathematics and geometry. And the beauty of, for instance, affine geometry is that it relates time and motion. The movement is not described in Cartesian coordinate, but it's described along the movement, along the form. It's a form which is very beautiful. And that gave a rise to, because I'm going to use that for empathy in a moment, to a collaboration I had with two artists, Michel Brett and Marie-Hélène Tramus from the Department of Numerical Art in Paris 8 here. They are artists. And they had built a funambule, dancing. Sorry, I don't do it. And this funambule was done with programs which were from networks, and it was a kind of a strange dancing. So what I did, we discussed many times. It was very beautiful multidisciplinary interaction. And what I did is that I gave them a few of the laws of natural movement. Coplanar variation, two-third power law. I mean, we have a number of these laws that we know from physiology now. And the deal with them, for them, was not to do like in cinema, where you implement these things, or motion capture, to have the creatures look like natural. The deal was, as Jérôme said in his introduction, j'ai bien écouté, was to allow them to break the laws, to produce emotion. So the deal was that it was, and we published that in Leonardo actually, it was my only publication in an art journal. Comment? C'est la seule, mais je suis très fier parce que c'était 3 ans de travail ensemble, de discussion, d'interaction, pour se comprendre. Hein? To use the... And so they had them for this funambule, and then they used this funambule in artistic shows, like, for instance, real dancers and the funambule dancing on the wall, and then suddenly the funambule did something not natural, surprise, interaction, etc. So these laws can also be used for breaking them and creating some surprise, emotion, thinking like what the artists do when they do not reproduce a real gesture, but when they eventually break it. But you are more competent than I am on that. I would like to mention also this because it's, I found this very interesting. It's a paper by Julie Grèze, who, as you know, is in École Normale here. and who have studied a lot of things concerning bodily expression of emotion with Béatrice de Gelder. And she has a very beautiful paper with Dick Passingham and Patrick Haggard, where they showed that being familiar to a gesture allows the neuron system, but a number of other systems to be activated more. And I mentioned that because, of course, it relates with the experiments that Stephanie and her collaborators showed to us. It's not, there can be a priming, in a sense, if I can use this word, but I may be not using it properly. There is a kind of priming of the capacity to understand a gesture, or eventually a static form on picture, by the fact that you are familiar. So Toulouse-Lautrec, if you look at the dancers, you may be actually more able to infer the movement from the stroke or from the movement if you are familiar, if you have experienced it, which is one of the bases, I think, of the work which was presented earlier this morning, in a sense. So it's also true for sports, but in general. So I wanted to mention that because there is a literature on this important familiarity, because somehow it does prime the brain, probably with forms. The experiment, for those of you who did not know it, they took people dancing capoeira. I don't know if some of the young people here or older people dance capoeira. Qu'est-ce qui danse la capoeira? Personne, no? And some classic dances, and they showed in the MRI reciprocally to the people used with classic dance, the capoeira, etc. And they could show that those who were more familiar to one of the dances would activate more the important circuits. All right. So that's a few things I wanted to say about the type of physiology we are doing now on gesture and the study of these mechanisms we are trying to explore on why we have this capacity to infer from whether it is a stroke or movement, in an artwork, what happens there, or the intention. Now, what about gaze? Gaze, so la vision et palpation par le regard. I happen to have a student, Isadora Olivet, who came from cinema and painting, came to me about 6 years ago. And she said, when I am in the movie and I see two people caressing each other, I feel caressed on my body. Elle était un peu synesthésiste. And she wanted to work with me because she had, because of physiology. And we started a co-directed thesis with her boss in the Department of Art. And after a while, the professor said, the brain is, I don't want to hear about the brain. But fortunately, she continued to work, and Marie-Hélène Tramus was nice enough to continue helping for that. And she wanted to show that when we perceive two people doing a gesture or caressing each other, this would activate actually the somatosensory. Once more, I missed it. It was done. The experiment was done, and it's in the fMRI literature, which I'm sure Stephanie knows. It was done by in Marseille, together with the Rizzolatti group, I think Gallese. And they showed that indeed, when you perceive two people touching each other, they did it with touching their hand or the leg, you do activate here the same areas that would be activated if you are being caressed yourself. So that is one example, which is the neuronal implementation of this idea of Merleau-Ponty. But having reminded you of that, just a few things about gaze. There are multiple functions of gaze. First of all, of course, as you know, there is what I call les chemins du regard, the fact that you look with saccades, and that depending on what you want to look at in the scene, the scan path with the saccades will be different. And having had this early contact with Jérôme when he showed me the Van Gogh paintings, he asked me either to look at the background, La Tempête, or the fixers. And we have to remember that we do not look, we do not generate exploration paths on a picture depending on what we want to look at. And the second thing is that we should remember that when we want to look at something, we sometimes do not look where we want to look. Meaning that if I want to have a feeling about the global room here, I may put my gaze here and not go around. So it's not as simple as that. And we decide to look, and we have now, over the years, a rather good idea about the mechanisms which are involved in this decision to look. Because when I was looking at your last slide of Seurat, who for me was, I was telling you, mainly lines. C'était des dotted lines. I didn't see the dot, I saw dotted lines, movements. It was very different, whether I looked at this thing as dotted lines or whether I looked individual dots or the picture, etc. So depending on where we attend to, what we attend to, we should remember that we actually are going to extract very different things. And of course, there is a lot of literature on that. We know now better the structures which are involved in this decision to look, which as you can see, are complex. They also involve memory, etc. We also know that if I ask you to fixate the P here, and for instance, prepare a saccade either to the left or to the right. So you look at the P, and when I say go, you make a saccade left or right. When I tell you go left, you activate these premotor areas here in the brain. When I tell you look at the P but prepare exploration to left or right, prepare to examine this or part of the shift of attention without execution, we see the activation of these prefrontal areas. And when you decide left or right, depending about your political opinion, for instance, you see the appearance of all this prefrontal activity, which is completely absent. So we now have a lot of literature also, which allows us to really analyze a bit more, and there is, of course, a literature on that, the mechanisms of shift of attention. And if you look at the picture, at the data from Corbetta and these people, you will see that there is an enormous literature now which says, as we had shown many years ago with PET, that there are common circuits for shift of attention without eye movements and for saccading. So when we look at the painting, if we look at the nose, and if we just shift attention around, taking, for instance, in consideration the background, we will activate similar areas to if we look here and here and here and here. Very interesting. So this is another field which may be interesting if we would be interested in the next project as to the strategies we employ into extracting these contextual or detailed or form things. Because now, in the last 5 years, there's a lot. We also know there are models. This one is from Étienne Quéclin, here from École Normale again, who has worked a lot with the hierarchy that he has proposed, BA6, sensory motor activation, external context, BA44, 9, past, this is the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, and then this BA10 here, which is the area involved in branching, logical branching, hierarchy of goals, sub-goals. So there are models now, and he also has produced, I have it later, another model with motivation. So basically, what we know now also is that when we look at a picture, whether it's movement like here, or whether it's static, like in painting, but today a lot of painting is going to be numerical movement. Depending on what we attend to, a movement, this was done in our lab many years ago already, depending upon whether we pay attention to form, color, or movement, or background, or whatever, we activate these different sub-areas in the grain which are involved in detection of movement, etc. And this is an area which is well known of the group here.
Is that still pictures, movement, implied
Sorry?
movement? Is that implied movement in still pictures?
The experiments here were done with movement.
Okay.
But this is probably also true for static picture, I would infer, although I have no data. So, yeah, this was done on television screen, where you put it on auxiliary channel. You have all the dots moving, and then you give to each dot a little vector, which would correspond to the movement it would have if it would be 3D. So you can perceive, like à la télévision, dès que ça bouge, on voit là. So you can perceive the form, or you can pay attention to the color. So you can, with this manipulation, but it's on movement. But basically, I think it's also going to be true, maybe. And there is literature probably. Now, attention. So I've been talking about attention. Here again, we should be careful, because every concept au singulier, l'attention actually is made of many mechanisms. And there are many types, as you all know probably, of attention, l'attention sérielle, parallèle, etc. So many processes. So it's a general property of the brain to select, and we have to be careful at any of these concepts, as many of you are philosophers. In the Collège de France, we are supposed to teach something new every year, right? And preferably something we don't know anything about. This is the only requirement. And so for the last 15 years, every year I took a concept that I knew nothing about, which was relevant, and I became a first-year student. So I took la décision, l'identité, la perception, l'attention, and I gave my teaching to 500 people on things which I did not really understand. And what I discovered every time is that behind every of these singular concepts, there is actually a multiplicity. Like la mémoire, nobody speaks about la mémoire now. We know there are 5 or 6. And so we have to be careful about this problem of attention. Actually, the next project could be about attention. Comme j'ai rien fait à ce projet, as I did nothing for this project, I can propose something for the next one. Now, emotion. Now, we also, of course, are interested by emotion in spite of all the efforts of this lady to draw the attention of his husband. You can see that he's not looking at the picture she wants. And obviously, he's not looking at this picture with his gaze because not only about purely cognitive factors. Okay? So that is better than many papers. And we know that there are 2 brains, one cognitive brain, but we'll also this emotional brain. And we know that the entrance to this brain, which is very quick, much quicker than the cortex, is amygdala. Within 70 milliseconds, the amygdala attributes value. And it attributes value even to a form. Like if you see something which in the forest which has a form like a snake, even if it is sleeping, immediately your amygdala will trigger reaction, 70 milliseconds. Dangerous. And the same picture will be analyzed by the space system or by the identity system here, and you will discover that it is not a dangerous snake because it doesn't have the triangular head. So it's a couleuvre et pas une vipère, and then you take it and give it to your children. So emotional brain attributes to forms, static or dynamic, very quickly a value, transmits it to the orbital frontal cortex. It has also links with all the brain, and the orbital frontal cortex with an arbitre who can, as Rawls has shown very well, change the evaluation. So when you saw me the first time, you say this guy may be pas très sympathique or sympathique, and then when you hear me, you say after all it is not sympathique or sympathique, which is what your orbital frontal cortex may help you to do. So, and bonjour, entrez. Alors, voilà, 75 milliseconds, she looks sympathetic. And these two evaluations we know now are compared, and with the help, of course, of the dopamine system and all this. And this is important because well, I have no time, I think, to go into that, the Capgras, but when you, some people, you know the Capgras? The Capgras is un parenthèse, nothing to do with the subject of today, but it's, ça va? Capgras, the child does vélo and falls, has a problem, goes to hospital, and he says to his father when he comes back, "You are not my father. You look like my father, but you are not my father." And the psychanalyst said that eventually he saw his parents do something he should not see or whatever. But the modern neuroscientific way is to say that eventually the cognitive evaluation of the identity of the father was not anymore combined with the affective evaluation, because he may have had a lesion or something of the combination between the affective and the cognitive shape of the figure. So we should remember that always somehow these two systems work together, even maybe for simple forms. This is from Etienne again, beautiful man here in École Normale, who has recently proposed a theory saying that actually there is not only cognitive decision-making in prefrontal cortex and emotion but motivation. So I would like chocolate. I have been offered chocolate or whatever when I was at the buffet, and I prefer chocolate, and I will probably decide to take one or the other. So he has a proposal of the not the external, but the mid areas in the brain involved in motivation, emotion, selection, and he has mathematical. And whether these middle areas do deal with form, probably they do, as I will show a bit later. Of course, we all know, this is just known from everybody, that the orbital frontal cortex is involved in this marking, as Damasio said, of the cognitive evaluation to make a decision. And I think it is true. What I propose is also true for simple forms, or for attributing to a context the value, the emotional value. Now, another aspect of gaze is the regard regardé. That is this exchange between gaze. I will go into that a little bit, because I will end up by empathy, if you allow me this time. So, le regard regardé. The gaze is not only to look at things, but it's also to look at each other. And in paintings, of course, there is this great mystery of manipulation, in which actually I think the context also plays a role. We know that in children, small children, they are interested by direct gaze, but they don't really interact with others in complex ways, changing point of view. We also know from this nice work of Nathalie, who is now in Salpêtrière, together with Driver and Dolan, that establishing gaze contact immediately activates the amygdala in addition to the fusiform, so that if I establish contact with you, immediately I light your amygdalas. We can turn off the light, and I can look at you and gaze, and immediately our emotional brain is involved. So this is, I think, a very important contribution too, but it's not. And we also know that in the fusiform, and that there is this interesting dissociation on which I'm working in another framework concerning space, of the fusiform gyrus being involved in face recognition, amygdala being activated by gaze contact, but also parahippocampus involved in scenes, contexts. See? So with an interesting interplay between what is the subject of today, this contextual texturing or facture, whatever, and the areas involved in perceiving the faces, and there are many papers on that today, I think. Now, gaze, to stay into this idea of shared gaze. In order to share gaze, we have to be able to change point of view. I can look at this screen, but I could ignore you. But if I do this, I designate the screen to you. So I start taking you into account, je, tu, il, and this we know appears at 1 year of age. When we want to, the reason for which I speak about that is that today I think we should also be interested, maybe, if I propose that to you, not only by the solipsist interaction, as the philosopher says, of me with the picture, but also the way we share. When Jérôme came to my lab and showed me these things, he said, look, Alain, look at the importance of that. So we were sharing that together. So we are now in this time of social neuroscience, I think. We also know that there is a pathology called heterotopoagnosia, by which people cannot share, adults. And then we have also this interesting, paper, which does not concern static pictures and frame, but I think it's extremely interesting, from the group in Israel, Malach, and his colleagues, looking at films. And what he did, you may know this work, he took EEG, like if I like to see how eventually you share the perception of what is on the screen, he took two people and did the EEG on the two, and he showed that the activation of specific areas in the brain involved, for instance, the fusiform gyrus in face perception, or other areas for gesture. These areas, if he looked at the EEG, were synchronized in time between two people. Remarkable finding. So if you are in the cinema and you are sitting near to each other, at a given time, your fusiform gyrus may be synchronized in time, which of course is very interesting in terms of the fundamental basis des effets de la foule, and which is of course interesting when you want to share a picture. So there are now interesting data concerning, and that would be interesting also to look at. And it's also true for perception of context, paysage, and it would be interesting actually to look at that also for movement perception. And of course, in social interaction, you need to change perspective. We know that the child can only make this manipulation of perspective after a certain age, but I will skip that. And we now have experiments to try to understand this relation between the focal examination of figures and the context in perspective change. This is one experiment. For instance, I can do it with you. You see this puppet here and this lamp. This is in the La Corbusier villa. This is in virtual reality. And in the next slide, I will show you the lamp from the point of view of the puppet. And you have to tell me if it is true or not. Yes or no? So what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to get you to get embedded in this room, but now to take the point of view of the puppet. I'm trying to get you to now go away from your seat and stand as this puppet in this room, taking into account the geometry here. And now you can answer yes or no. Yes. Well, here is yes. Yes. And so you can fool the brain. You can sometimes say yes or no. And we have been able to with hippocampal patients to show what are the areas of the brain which are involved in this manipulation of the context of space and the point of view of a person. So the relation between the person and the context in which he is placed. And for that we also have a theory, which is that we actually use our double, because we are two. We have not only a body image, a body scheme, but we have, from recent neuroscience, the neural basis now of all these illusions, autoscopy, out-of-body experience. And we know that it is this area here in the brain, temporoparietal junction, together with STS, which is involved in constructing a second self. And that's important because it means that when we are looking at a picture and when we are integrating all these things, we are doing it with eventually our second self. Ça fait un peu parapsychologie, but now it's become part of the modern neuroscience. So we are indeed two, and many things we do are actually done using this second self that we have here. And the best example is not only phantom limbs, but dreams. I don't know if you dream. I dream. I have every night, all my life, nightmares. And they are absolutely real. I spent all last night having an earthquake, and all the city disappeared. And I could see completely, although we know the brain is completely disconnected. So basically, our brain does not need the world. And when we want to discuss these things about the effect of la texture, we have to remember that we are not using eventually our perception, but we are also using this internal Umwelt. And I am working on these things now together with a group here, very close to here, l'École Nationale des Arts et Métiers, François Garnier. What he has done is that he has created a virtual painting gallery in Berlin. He is in Berlin, and half Berlin, half Paris. So you are in your room, I am in my room, and each of us is in front of his screen, and each of us has an avatar in the virtual world. Because all young people now, they have 1, 2, 3 avatars, right? Qui a des avatars? Who has an avatar here? Nobody? Do you have an avatar? No. Well, most young people have or will have an avatar. So each of us has an avatar in this virtual world, and we are both in front of a picture. And so he has shown, and the reason for which they came to see us is that they have been impressed by how much people felt in the virtual world. They started discussing between the two avatars, even if they didn't know each other. So we have a double, and we can teletransport ourselves, even when we look at a picture. And we could discuss in Berlin, in one of the pictures, the importance of the facture. And that is an interesting topic of study today, actually, is how much these avatars, how much can we perceive through these avatars? Can we perceive only the identity or context or whatever? Ça va? J'ai encore 1 minute ou combien?
Oui.
Combien?
3 minutes.
No, I will take a bit more. Sorry.
So what did you
I finish by empathy, because il m'a demandé. Well, okay, and we are philosophers here. So the concept, all this, what I said before, was to introduce a theory of empathy that we have proposed. As you know, the philosophers have already discussed that many years ago, and I've been working with Gérard Jorland here. He's a historian of science and philosopher, and Bérangère Thiriou, a philosopher. Initially, she became neuroscientist. And remember that in Germany, in Germans, sympathy, Mitfühlung, with to feel, spatial and temporal process by which individual experience the same thing as the other in experiencing and at the same time. Empathy, Einfühlung, into feel, spatial process, c'est pour ça que ça m'a intéressé aussi, which individuals project mentally themselves in the other body. Je pense avec le double. Okay, so that was the theory, which, as you know, was also used for aesthetics by the German philosophers. And I've proposed, therefore, what I call a spatial theory of empathy, by which, apart from the emotional aspect, in order to be with a person, like here, or with a painting, in real empathy, that it means to really feel, pour le cri, to really feel what the other guy is feeling in the painting, or the effect of the context, one has to change perspective. So sympathy is just imitation, mirror neurons, emotional contagion. If you cry, I start crying. If you yawn, I will yawn. If I smile, you will tend to smile. This is sympathy for me. But we stay at our place. And this is also with gesture, with this beautiful painting of Van Gogh, which repeats this age at which the child and the person imitate themselves. This is sympathy. You resonate. And I think a number of the papers published even in Science or which are called empathy are actually dealing with sympathy. You know, today you can even buy an empathic dishwasher. So there is an imposture of the use of the term empathy, because in many cases it's actually not real empathy. It is actually just contagion, sympathy. Empathy consists in really Einfühlung, putting in the place of the other. If I want to know what you think of my talk, I have to go and sit in your place. I believe using our double, virtual body or whatever, but I have to remain myself too. I have to feel your emotion or your point of view from your point of view. But eventually, and that is the most important thing in empathy, I have to inhibit emotion. If I am a doctor and I really want to be empathic, I have to be able to feel the suffering from the point of view of the patient, but eventually it's no use that I start suffering myself, as in sympathy. So empathy, the hypothesis is that it is going to be a number of systems in the brain in competition and collaboration involving spatial perspective, emotion, etc., and not only mirror neuron or sympathy. And this is what we have tested with the funambule, by which I started. And I will ask you to do the experiment. Could you all put your hands like this? Après, c'est fini. Un peu d'exercice. Could you put your hands like this? Thank you. Yes. You've done it already, so you don't need to do it anymore. Okay, and you do like me as quickly as possible. 1, 2, 3. No. Could you please do like me? I have my right hand down. Okay. You stayed in your place. You were in sympathy, in mirror. You were not in empathy. You did not put yourself in the place of Berthoz. That is the theory. And it took you about 1 second, a number of you, to do that. And so we designed this experiment with Marie-Hélène and Tramus. We derived from the funambule the experiment, and we showed that there were these two behaviors. And then we went to Lausanne to do the EEG and record the brain activity. And we could show that after about 600 milliseconds, which is the time it took you eventually to change to the other strategy, we had activation of all these different systems, distinction between self and others, mirror neuron, etc. So a number of areas, and we could, in a nutshell, all this is published in the last 3 or 4 years in several papers. So we have two systems, two behaviors when we interact with a picture. We can be in embodied mirroring process, self-location, but we stay in symmetry. And it's very interesting because it corresponds to some pathology, which is actually otoscopy. But we can also be in a situation which we're after, having think about it, which is changing perspective. And this activates other areas. And that is interesting because it does also correspond to eotoscopy. And now we even have a paper published a few weeks ago, accepted a few weeks ago, where we actually see the beautiful change. So we showed, instead of looking here, we looked at what happens here and here, about 300 milliseconds. So at the beginning, we see the picture, have the visual areas, and at some point, about 3 to 400 milliseconds, there is something is happening, and then there is the distinction between the two types of interaction with the picture of the funambule. So we really have different ways to interact, and of course we have done that with a picture. We have not done a study concerning the role of the facture, but maybe that could be also interesting to do. C'est fini. Merci.